So as mentioned, I'm the Director of Addiction Services at Linden Oaks Behavioral Health. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist by training, and this is a topic that I've spoken out about a lot, that of marijuana and vaping, because like Matt was alluding to, there are very rich people trying to get even more rich at the expense of young people. And he talked about that in terms of the flavorings. There's just a lot of practices, and when 90% of addictions start before you're 20 or 18, then if you're in the business of addiction, that's where you look. And so my passion is making sure that people know what's really going on, and so that they can talk about this subject and feel confident in the information, and that they can approach decisions with open eyes, so that they don't have to necessarily believe what they've been told by people who have financial interests in them believing certain things. So my hope for you, for both my section and also in general for tonight, is that you leave feeling like you've got information that you can act on. Because listening is great, discussions are great, but action is the most important thing, particularly when we're talking about the health of kids. So for my section, we're going to start with cannabis and marijuana, talk about why it's a particularly bad idea for kids, and then I'll touch on vaping a little bit at the end as well. So the first is that there is an increased risk of addiction for young people. Now this is an interesting thing. There's this myth that marijuana is not addictive, and that could not be any more untrue. It is the second most common substance that we treat at Linden Oaks for adults, and the most common substance that we treat for adolescents. There has been a documented physiological, so in the body addiction syndrome found for this that we've seen for 15 years. It's in all of our manuals. The thing about it is though, and I'll get to the brain in a second, is that it's addictive more like alcohol is addictive rather than like heroin or methamphetamine or cocaine's addictive, in that you're not going to just use it a couple times and get hooked. It's kind of like with alcohol, where you start using it socially and eventually it becomes what your social group does a lot, and then eventually you're using it to deal with the stressors in your life, and then you're doing it on your own, and it eventually hits that point where your body hits a trigger point and then it craves it. Yet we all understand that alcohol is addictive and that alcoholism is real. Yet there continues to be there's this myth that is not addictive. It is. Simply put, it absolutely is. Not only that, but you are more vulnerable when you're a young person. The CDC tells us that 1 in 10 people who's an adult and who uses will develop a use disorder, and 1 in 6 young people. So why is it so much higher? It has to do with the brain development. Your brain is not done developing until the age of 25. The last part to develop is that part that's blue all the way throughout all those brains in the front, called the prefrontal cortex. And that's the part of your brain that's involved in personality, but also in terms of executive function. These are things like the ability to think abstractly, to plan into the future, to synthesize a lot of different ideas. Very important skills for a lot of things, but particularly for addiction. When it comes on slow, and sometimes even feels good in the beginning, you really have to be able to see the whole picture. And so young people are particularly at risk, which is why when you look at marketing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation, it's all angled young. Now it's also worth mentioning this isn't Woodstock pot anymore. It is it's much stronger. So Matt already did a great job in covering that, but it's not the same stuff. Lighting up 7 Woodstock joints is one of today's. It's very different. And we know that it's related to negative academic and vocational outcomes. So specifically in terms of high school and college, I'll combine them a little bit here. We know that it leads to lower grades, higher dropout rates, and more school disciplinary problems. In college, increased chances to skip class, lower GPA, potentially longer time to graduate. Now there's a lot of reasons for this. Some of them have to do with the shape of the brain. And more on that in, I think, the next slide, or very soon. But there's also that part about social and functional. Now what that's getting at is that if you are hanging out with a group of people who is using marijuana for fun, it's probably not the same group of people at the library on a Thursday night studying for the history test. And so what ends up happening is that you select yourself into a group of people who don't achieve at as high of a level on average as the people who don't behave in those ways. And at a certain point, you hit these little break points where maybe your GPA is that much lower and you go to a slightly different school, or you don't get into the same grad program, or little things happen along the way, which is why that last point, that it leads to decreased lifetime earning potential. We found that in some studies as well. That when people look back retrospectively on their life, what they find is that the more pot and THC products you've used, the less money on average you make. And that's, again, that doesn't mean like take $50 out of your pocket for each joint you smoke. That's not how risk works, but it's about what influences are you exposing yourself to, and do they help you maximize your potential, or do they potentially lead to pitfalls that will significantly hold you back? Now, the next one, brain morphology changes. It actually changes the physical shape of your brain when you use marijuana and THC products before it's done developing. And I know this sounds kind of like fear-mongering-esque, but it is just simply true, and I'd like to talk to you guys a little bit about what it means. So there are a lot of studies where we've looked at brain imaging studies, where we've looked at the physical shape of the brain and the impact of marijuana use on the physical shape of the brain. I want to talk about a couple studies in particular here. Those bars on the right that are far too small to read, what it's getting at, the title there, the role of cannabinoids and neuroanatomic alterations in cannabis users. That's a really bad thing. You never want to see something say it will change the shape of your brain for pretty much any reason. But that's what it's talking about. It's a big meta-analysis looking at a bunch of different studies. And what those little lines are saying, and I'll tell you what it says because I know it's a bit small. For each of the lines, if the portion of the line is gray, it means the study did not look at that brain segment. If it's blue, it means they did look at the brain segment and found no effect. But if it's red, that means that they looked at that part of the brain in the study and found a structural change. And that top row is looking at dosage. So that means that by dose, what's the chance that your brain is physically changed forever by using THC products? The two I want to point out, the second one from the left, the one that's mostly red, that is the hippocampus. In about 85% of studies, dosage of marijuana was related to changes in the hippocampus. That's the part of your brain associated with learning and memory. Now, the other one I want to point out is 3 overs, the one that's about 50-50. It's actually 40%. That is the prefrontal cortex, that last part of your brain to develop, the one that has to do with personality and executive function. 40% by dosage. That next row down, the label there says duration. So that means it doesn't matter how strong the product you're using is. And again, today's THC products are very strong. The flower is 7 times as strong. The concentrates are wildly more potent. It doesn't matter how strong it is, just how long you use it. And the 2 lines with red are, again, the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. And these are not things that grow back. This isn't like you get a scab and it comes back. When you're growing up, your brain grows in some places and prunes in others. And if you introduce a chemical that changes that brain develop, you don't get to have that back. And so, again, I know this can sound kind of like fear tactic-y, but it's just simply true. No one under the age of 25 should be using THC products, and that's what the Surgeon General says as well. Now, what does that do to your ability to think? This is another study that was looking at cognitive function of marijuana users through grade school. And the 4 boxes there are looking at working memory in the top left, so short-term memory, nonverbal reasoning in the top right, long-term memory in the bottom left, and your ability to control your behaviors on the right. And in each of those graphs, you can see that the blue and the red lines are always on opposite sides of the middle. The blue line is the no marijuana condition, and the red line is the most marijuana condition. And on each graph, if the blue is on the bottom, that's the good one. That's where you want it to be. And if the blue is on the top, that's where you want it to be. And so you can see that on each graph, red is on the opposite side every single time. The bottom line is that when you add THC products into the developing mind, it is not a value add. In fact, it actually can damage it in ways that show up physically and functionally. A couple other points I want to make sure we talk about. Impaired judgment, of course, when you're high, you make decisions you might not otherwise make, like increased risky sexual behavior we've seen in young people, as well as psychotic breaks. And this is a really critical aspect I want to make sure we talk about. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this a psychotic break is what happens when you develop schizophrenia. And more, we've seen, I want to say dozens at this point, probably dozens of studies that link marijuana use and psychotic breaks. This one made national news. It was in Lancet Public Health, one of the most, actually this was, I believe, Lancet Psychiatry, one of our most prestigious journals. They found that in Europe, 12.2% of first episode case of psychosis could have been prevented if not for THC products, including 30% in London and 50% in Amsterdam. In general, you're 50% more likely to have a psychotic break if you're using today's marijuana flower, and 500% more likely if you're using the concentrates. At Linden Oaks, right now, at any point in time, and I asked our manager on the unit this, we've got an adolescent inpatient unit, around 2 and 5, this is a recently updated stat, 2 and 5 kids in there at any point in time who are psychotic because of marijuana. I was at a school in Plainfield, third week of school. They said they hospitalized 3 kids in 3 weeks, in the first 3 weeks of school, because of these psychotic breaks. It is, of course, not everybody. That would be ridiculous, but it's not as rare as you think. And the more THC, the greater the chance is that this is going to happen. The other study that made national news, about 5 days later actually, was that ED visits tripled in Colorado after they legalized. And actually we started to see this here as well, and there were 2 reasons for that. One of them was, one of them are these psychotic breaks, but the other is cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. And this is something else that is people need to know about. When you overdose on THC, you can have a condition start called cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, where you have very severe abdominal pain and you cannot stop vomiting for a very long period of time. It's very noisy and very violent. We've already seen it in our EDs. I was in an Edward Emergency Department strategic planning meeting about a month back where they were planning on how they're going to handle more of these patients. And they've already got their protocols. You generally hook up an IV so people don't dehydrate themselves and put them in the pot in the back because they're screaming and they're very noisy. And wait, you can kind of put a hot compress on their core as well, which can kind of help. But it's just really unpleasant. And we are already seeing it. And the THC levels in these folks are off the charts. And so the more that we're going to see people using these high formulations, the more we're going to see it. And it actually has killed people. That's another thing that you'll hear sometimes. Marijuana's never killed anybody. It absolutely has killed people. This was back from September. I pulled it off of USA Today. This was someone who literally vomited himself to death from dehydration, a 17-year-old. From using THC products. And I think there was a forensic toxicology journal that I've got back in my office. It was something like 226 cases over 6 years where it was a contributing cause of death, and it was the single cause of death in about 20 of them. So it's not nearly the same thing as, say, alcohol or opioids, for sure, but it's killed people. It's absolutely killed people, and it's something that we have to be very mindful of, particularly for young folks. Drug to driving, I'm going to just touch on very briefly. I think Detective Wostocki will talk a little bit more about it. But the one point I want to make, and was also made in that video, it is not safe to drive high. And this is something where there's a lot of misconceptions. One statistic that I heard was that kids are 4 times more likely to be in a car with a high driver or to drive high than in a car with a drunk driver or drive drunk. Because there's this perception that you're just going to drive slower and that'll make you safer or something. That is not, well, truly, it's not supported by research and it's not supported by statistics. It is actually much more unsafe for a number of reasons, which we don't have time to go into today. But the bottom line is, just to point out one example here, finger to nose misses here. The median for people with any THC in their system was 5, and the median was 0 for people with no THC in their system. So there's a lot more we could say about this. The bottom line is that it does impair you, and people need to be very aware of that now that it's more accessible. I also want to touch on the point of this being a gateway drug, because this is another confusing thing where people think there's controversy about this. In addiction, we know there's not any controversy. It is, and I want to explain why. So this is national level data that shows the difference between young people who use marijuana and those who don't. And you can see the second set of bars in the middle there shows that they're 10 times higher, 10 times more likely to use illegal drugs if they're using marijuana. This is a graph that shows the chances that you're going to develop a new addiction to prescription opioid pills if you use marijuana. And you can see the odds ratios there go up 5 times for occasional use and 8 times for frequent or very frequent use. So again, occasional use of recreational marijuana means you're 5 times more likely to develop an addiction to opioids, and 8 times more likely if you use it all the time. And we know that 92% of people who use heroin have used marijuana first. Now, a lot of people say that correlation doesn't prove causation, and that's absolutely true. It doesn't. However, we don't know that cigarettes cause cancer because we didn't have a study where 50,000 people smoke cigarettes for 60 years, and then another 50,000 don't, and we see who's dead. We didn't do that. Instead, what we have is a lot of ironclad correlations over years and a mechanism of action. We can see that cigarettes and nicotine cause a DNA mutagenesis, and that's what causes cancer. So we see how that works. Now, with THC and drug sequencing, we see the exact same thing. So we've got ironclad correlations over years, but the mechanism of action isn't purely biological because that's not how addiction works. Let me explain. Say, for example, you've got a young person, and their friend walks up and says, "Hey, I've got a bag of heroin. You want to tie off and inject?" They'd probably be like, "No, I don't. That's a pretty tough sell. And do you need some help, right?" That's never going to happen. But now imagine instead that a young person sees vaping everywhere and they're starting to vape. And then someone shows up with a THC pod or vape pen and says, "You want to try this?" Or, here's marijuana, right? It's legal now. It's just a plant. Isn't it medicine anyway? That's a much lower bar, so you start doing that. And then the group of people you're hanging out with are then more likely to expose you at a party, for example, say, to a bar of Xanax, some cocaine, a hallucinogen. And maybe at some point someone brings along some Percocet or hydrocodone, Norco. And you try that and you really like that because that creates some euphoria. And then eventually that doesn't do enough for you. You're buying heroin because it's cheaper, but you're snorting it because that's a lot more palatable than injecting it. And then eventually you're injecting it because nobody starts by injecting heroin. Nobody does. If that is step 5, you do not get to step 5 without doing step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and then step 5. And what gateway means, literally, is you do not get to step 5 without step 1. 92% of people start right there. So literally, it opens a gateway to what's next. You will, in all likelihood, never make it down that progression if you don't start. It doesn't mean you're going to do it, but it means you've given yourself the chance to do it. It's about risk. So the last couple things I want to talk about before my time is up is marketing, and that it's always on purpose. I don't know if any of you guys have been to dispensaries already or even went to them while they're medical, but our dispensary here in Naperville is still medical because the town voted not to allow recreational sales when they opened in January. But this is the way that the products are named right now. Things like 707 Headband and Blue Cheese, Durban Poison, Bio Jesus, Flow, Grape God Bud, Ghost Train Haze, Gorilla Glue, Island Sweet Skunk, Platinum Girl Scout Cookies, and OG18. Do you guys know what OG stands for? Shout it out. Original Gangster, right. So here's the thing. This is never and was never marketed at 65-year-old women with MS, right? Goldfish crackers aren't shaped like goldfish because they were born that way. It's because kids like them. And the same thing's true for animal crackers. It's so that you can systematically bite off all their heads, right? That's on purpose. It's not just me. You all know you did it. So, but that's why you do it. And so when you say for OG18 that it was the winner of the High Times Cannabis Cup in 09 and 010, that's not an accident. You don't market medicine that way unless you have other reasons for it. And again, they know their market. They know their market. They're also selling green crack right now. This is a product that you can buy right now at dispensaries, green crack. Actually, you can't read it, but it's a 27% THC product. Again, much stronger than it used to be at Woodstock. And here's how people are advertising vape pens. And so again, when you look at this and you ask, does this look like a 45-year-old chain smoker? No, it doesn't. I mean, I don't think anyone can even bend like that over the age of 27. I mean, look at that. I'd even break in half. And here's where Juul started. And again, take a look at this, right? Who does this look more like? The people they say that they're aimed at, or the people who are actually using their product? Matt mentioned the Truth Initiative. They did a study that found that 16 out of 17 people who uses a Juul is a teenager. And so if you remember that this is a business, if 16 out of 17 of your customers is a teenager, what would happen if they actually stopped using it? You know what I'm saying? You'd absolutely go under. And this is how the addiction for profit industry has always worked. You say one thing, but then you do another because it doesn't go over well if you look like you're going after young people. But you do. Just a couple more anecdotes, and then I've got to finish up because of time. But in a congressional testimony, they went into a 9th grade classroom and called this device totally safe. And it was also found that they spent $200,000 on social media influencers. And again, you don't use that to get at the 40 and up demo. You know what I'm saying? Like that's for younger people. Last point here, a study just came out recently in August that found that if you vape, you are 3.5 times more likely to start using THC. And that's, again, when we talk about gateways and progressions, that's what we're talking about. Doesn't mean you will. Just like if you speed, it doesn't mean that you're going to get into a car accident, but we have speed limits because we know the faster you drive, the more likely you are to get into a car accident. So the question is, what risks are you exposing yourself to? So to sum this up, vaping and marijuana are both chronically misunderstood, and this is not an accident. Again, these are all businesses, and they know who their market is, and they know, Matt had the slide up there about how as perception's been going down, as risk and potency has been going up, that's not an accident, guys. That's on purpose. And that's because that sells. There's a pivot in the addiction world between perceived risk and use. The less risky people think a substance is, the more people who use it. And so if that's your business, you're very well aware of that. Just like Big Tobacco did their own research for years saying that it didn't cause cancer, right? Because it's about money. From a health perspective, nobody should vape if they aren't already smoking cigarettes, and particularly not kids. Again, for kids, you're adding toxins to your body. It's debatable whether or not it's actually better for you than cigarettes. It might be, but unless you're already smoking, you definitely should not do it. Worth mentioning as well, for the vaping epidemic that hospitalized folks, this just came out from the CDC about 2 weeks ago. 1 in 6 of the THC products came from a marijuana dispensary. It was not just black market vapes, and that's straight from the CDC. Marijuana is far from a benign substance. It's particularly harmful for youth, and these extracts can be vaped, and the higher potency is associated with stronger effects. That, in many ways, is the ultimate tragedy of this, is that these vaping devices that have become so popular deliver the strongest formulation of THC and the most harmful formulation of THC to young people who are at most at risk to be damaged by it.